obviously, the better. Lake Albert scoping study. Should have I asked this morning? Mr. Pabs. How much did the federal government...
I'm going to organise an honorary doctorate for him. So
I know, I'm sorry.
Make it easy.
Yeah. It's just the learned appearance that gets me every time.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's like I called you minister at the last estimates, I think. Maybe I had a premonition. Mr. Pabs, how much did the federal government put towards the scoping study for Lake Albert?
The Australian government contributed up to $668,606 to the scoping study.
Okay, and did the South Australian government contribute anything apart from probably some labour?
I believe so, but I don't have the figure in front of me.
Okay. The key findings, as I understand, were a number of options that address the improvement in the water quality in Lake Albert. Am I correct in suggesting that the study indicated that lake cycling was the preferred option?
The study, you're right, the study looked at 4 options and tested them against criteria, those criteria being effectiveness, project feasibility, community support and acceptable delivery period. 2 of the 4 options met those 4 criteria, or it was the assessment of the scoping study that 2 of the options considered met all 4 criteria. One of those was lake level cycling, and the 2 options that didn't meet it were removing the Narrung Bend and returning natural flows to the southern end of the Coorong.
Okay. As you'd probably be aware, there's been quite an amount of support and agitation towards accelerating the improvement of the water quality in Lake Albert by means that are likely to generate a speedier response than lake cycling. In terms of us as the federal government being satisfied that we got good value for our money in this particular study, do you think that the scoping study really did analyse the options and consider all those options? And do you think that the fact that the South Australia, that this particular scoping study has to a large extent disregarded the interconnector, it has been a fair and reasonable process?
I think our commentary around the scoping study as a Commonwealth agency has been limited to ensuring that the terms of the contractual arrangement that led to the commissioning of the scoping study, the delivery of it, whether it did what it said it would do, were adequately met, and we really have confined our commentary to that sort of review of it rather than the matters of substance. It's up to the South Australian government to decide which, if any, of those 4 options it intends to proceed with, and then essentially to prepare a business case for the Commonwealth government's further consideration. And at that point, we would provide a form of view, if you like, on the substance of the option being considered. There would, of course, in a number of those options, also be a necessity for an approvals process, because there would be a potential to impact on the environment. So there would be a separate process to be gone through as well. It is likely there would be a separate process under Commonwealth legislation and state legislation. At this stage, as you know, Senator, the South Australian Minister for Water has stated that the South Australian Government's preferred position is to proceed with the lake level cycling option. But we haven't received any formal advice from the South Australian Government to that end yet.
Would it, the tangible outcomes that are likely to be delivered from the various options be something that we as a federal government would be concerned about? The reason I say that is that it strikes me as that there doesn't seem to be any benchmarks or targets that we've put in place in terms of what is actually the measure of quality in Lake Albert that we're seeking to achieve, and also the corresponding issue that we have with the Coorong, obviously being a Ramsar site, I mean, what are our tangible measures of outcome that we're seeking in our watering plan to be able to achieve the, the environmental outcomes that we're seeking to, and how do we integrate those outcomes into what appears to be somewhat isolated as a bit of a, we don't want to build the interconnector, we just want to use lake cycling in isolation?
It's a very comprehensive question, Senator, and I can give you a broad response, and to the extent that I'm not able to satisfy your need for detail, I'll take the remainder of the question on notice. But there are, in fact, you're quite right. What would you assess this against? What are the outcomes you're trying to see? You absolutely need that to make any judgment about a specific proposal. And in the case of the Coorong Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth, there are some targets. There are, for example, salinity targets in the lakes, Alexandrina and Albert. I know you're going to ask me those targets, and I don't have them at the top of my head, but they are aimed, broadly speaking, to get the salinity levels back to both historical levels, which is much, much lower than they are at the moment, and to levels which makes the water suitable for extraction and utilisation, for example, in watering domestic stock. And there are targets, specific targets relating to the Coorong, Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth that relate to the ecology of those systems. Those targets are found in part in the basin-wide environmental watering strategy, which has been developed by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and recently released. Again, I don't have them off the top of my head, but I can certainly provide you with the specific detail within that strategy. And because much of the site is a listed Ramsar site, it has what is known as an ecological character description. So this is something that is common to all of Australia's Ramsar sites. At the time of the listing, there is a documentation of the key ecological characteristics of that site. It's essentially an attempt to document in a very scientific way what are the values of the site that have led to its listing as a wetland of international significance. And the Ramsar Convention requires the signatory countries, in this case jointly Australia as the signatory and South Australia as the managing authority, to manage those Ramsar sites in an attempt to ensure that there are no unacceptable changes to the ecological character. Again, the ecological character description for these areas are quite complex. I don't have them in my head, but they go to things, for example, like salinity, but they also go to ecological characteristics. So it's the assemblage of fauna and flora. In the Coorong, for example, it goes to the presence of a species of aquatic plant called rupia. You're probably familiar with this as a South Australian, which is one of the drivers of the food chain in the Coorong. So there are a very detailed list of ecological characteristics which guide the management. And so whether you're assessing something like lake cycling or, say, an interconnector from the lake to the Coorong, or indeed any of the other projects that impact on the Coorong, Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth, you have to take account of all of those required outcomes.
Yeah. I suppose the question was really more targeted at that, what influence do we have as a federal government on the outcomes that are delivered generally in that area? Because one of the concerns that's constantly raised with me when I'm down there, and I'm sure other South Australian members and senators would have had the same thing, is that there is this belief that the South Australian government already had a predetermined idea of what the outcome they wanted from this particular study. And rightly or wrongly, I mean, it's an accusation. I'm not saying whether it's right. I'm agreeing with it, but that the South Australian government made a major investment in pipeline infrastructure down there, and it doesn't serve their best interest to have the water quality in Lake Albert such that the irrigators down there can start pumping out of it again for stock and domestic and irrigation purposes, because at the moment they're getting $3.45 per kilolitre for the water that these people are having to pay to pump out of it. So I just wondered, given that we have, been provided the lion's share of the money, whether we oversee whether the outcomes that are being delivered are genuine outcomes that are truly trying to deliver both the social, economic and the environmental outcomes that we're seeking from the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and what you're seeking to achieve by the water that you hold when you use it for environmental purposes.
Yeah, I see the point that in effect is a slightly different question to the one about the outcomes that I answered previously. There is a limited extent of influence that the Commonwealth has. The most direct influence that we have from my perspective is in terms of the decisions I make about the use of Commonwealth environmental water within the Coorong, Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth. And it is true to say that that is a complicated and complex arrangement. So it involves both myself as the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, the South Australian Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources, DUNA, and also the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, which has a formal role in the management of the lakes and the Murray Mouth. I think probably I would say that the joint management of that, particularly under the new arrangements where there are significant amounts now of Commonwealth environmental water available to deliver on the outcomes that I spoke about previously, means that we are attempting to move the management arrangements to a more sophisticated level. So that is, we are talking to our colleagues both in the MDBA and in the South Australian Department about the development of an agreed and joint management, long-term management plan for that area where the sorts of things that you're talking about can be aired in a very transparent way and hopefully get some broad agreement about the management strategies and the management parameters. I can't really comment on the observations around the state government's motivations. I simply don't know, and it's not wise for public officials to speculate. I do know, and I should have said, and you know this obviously, that there were two options that met those four criteria, the lake cycling and the interconnector, and the public statements by the South Australian Government in terms of favouring the lake cycling were, I think, at least publicly based on cost and time. But I really am not in a position to provide you with any detailed response as to the South
cost and time versus the amount of water that was going to be required for the decrease in the level of salinity and the water quality in the lake. So, no, explain that and look forward to seeing the outcome of this, and hopefully we get a good outcome for the people of Lake Albert who've been having a pretty tough time of it for a very long time. So.